was 29 at the time, and my life was quiet in a way I didn't think much about until later. I was working a remote job for a healthcare network based out of Wisconsin, which meant long hours on my laptop, a lot of email, and very little reason to leave the apartment during the week. My partner, Lena, was a high school art teacher. Summers were the only stretch where she could fully unplug, and by July she was usually burnt out in that slow, tired way teachers get when they've been talking all year and just want silence. We lived in Madison then, in a second-floor apartment above a bakery. It was fine. Nothing special, nothing bad. When we talked about taking a trip, it wasn't about adventure. It was about space. Somewhere quiet, somewhere with trees, somewhere where neither of us would feel obligated to do anything. Upper Michigan came up almost accidentally. Lena had grown up in Wisconsin, and her uncle used to take her fishing north of the bridge when she was a kid. She remembered the woods being dense and the towns being small, the kind of places where you could drive for half an hour and see nothing but pines and lakes. That sounded right to us. We didn't want a resort or a campground. We wanted a cabin, something private. Lena spent a few nights scrolling through rental listings and eventually found one that wasn't on Airbnb or anything like that. It was listed on a small regional vacation site that looked like it hadn't been updated in years. The photos were grainy and clearly old. The description was short, no address listed publicly, just a general location and a note saying directions would be provided after booking. That should have stood out more than it did. At the time, it just felt rustic. The listing talked about off-map privacy and true Northwoods isolation. There were no reviews, but the price was reasonable, and the email response from the owner was quick and polite. He signed his messages with just a first name, Tom. He sent us a PDF with directions that relied on mile markers, logging roads, and landmarks instead of street names. Things like turn left after the rusted culvert and ignore the first fork. Lena thought it was charming. We packed light, groceries, books, a few changes of clothes. Cell service wasn't guaranteed according to the listing, but that didn't bother us. We drove north early on a Monday, crossed the Mackinac Bridge mid-morning, and watched the landscape flatten and darken as the trees got thicker. The last gas station we passed was a small, single-pump place with a bait freezer out front. We filled up without talking about it. After that, the roads narrowed, then turned to gravel. The GPS lost the route about 10 minutes later. We followed the printed directions, turned where we were told, passed the culvert, took the second fork instead of the first. Eventually, we reached a narrow dirt track that didn't look maintained, more like something made by repeated use than planning. The trees closed in overhead, and the light changed. Then the cabin appeared. It wasn't visible until you were almost on top of it. A small single-story structure set back from the road, with weathered wood siding and a low porch. There was no fence, no signage, no neighboring buildings, just trees in every direction. It looked older than the photos, worn in a way that suggested it hadn't been improved in a long time. The windows were intact. The door was solid. There was a padlock on a small shed off to the side. Inside, it was clean, sparse but clean. A small kitchen, a living area with a couch and a wood stove, one bedroom and a bathroom with a shower that took a while to warm up. No TV, no internet. A landline phone mounted to the wall near the kitchen, which surprised me. The owner had left a handwritten note on the table. Welcome. Firewood stacked out back. Please keep doors locked at night due to wildlife. That last line felt normal enough. We'd been warned about bears in the area. We unpacked, made sandwiches, and spent the afternoon walking down to a nearby lake that wasn't named on the map, but was marked with a blue dot. The water was still and dark. There was no one else there. That first night was quiet in a way that felt intentional. We cooked dinner, lit a fire, and went to bed early. The second day passed much the same way. We hiked, we read, we talked about nothing important. There was no cell service, but the landline worked. Lena called her sister once, mostly to prove she could. The first knock came that night, a little after 11. Lena sat up in bed. My first thought was that someone was lost. Maybe another renter. Maybe someone local. I got dressed and walked to the door. I didn't open it. I asked who it was. A man's voice answered, "We're looking for the people who were staying here before you." I told him we'd just arrived the day before. There was a pause. Then he asked if I was sure. I said yes. He asked if the owner had told us anything about the place. I said no. Another pause. Then he said, "All right," and thanked me for my time. I watched through the window as two figures walked back toward the trees. They didn't have a car parked anywhere I could see. I locked the door and went back to bed. Lena asked what it was about. I told her. We both agreed it was strange, but not enough to leave. The second knock came the following night. Same time, same pattern. This time, there were 3 men. I didn't go to the door. I spoke through it again. They asked the same questions, but their tone had changed. Less polite, more insistent. One of them asked if there were 2 women inside. That was when Lena stood up behind me. I told them to leave. One of them laughed softly and said they just needed to talk. When they didn't leave, I told them I was calling the police. That was when one of them tried the handle. The lock held. There was a brief, tense silence, and then one of them kicked the door. Not hard enough to break it. Hard enough to test it. Lena ran to the bedroom and locked the door. I followed her. We barricaded it with the dresser and called 911 from the landline. The dispatcher took longer than I expected to understand where we were. The directions we had didn't translate easily. Outside, we could hear voices moving around the cabin. At one point, someone shouted that they knew we were inside, that we didn't belong there. Eventually, we heard engines, then shouting. The police arrived just after 2 in the morning, asked us a lot of questions that felt oddly reversed. Where had we booked the place? Who had we spoken to? How long had we planned to stay? They told us to pack our things. Back in Wisconsin, Lena's uncle helped us look into the property. The cabin wasn't listed in county records as a rental. It had changed hands several times in the last decade, always under LLCs that dissolved shortly after purchase. The cabin had been used as a temporary holding location, a place where people stayed briefly off the grid before being moved elsewhere. The previous occupants, the men we're asking about, hadn't left voluntarily. The owner name we'd been given wasn't real. I grew up in a fairly ordinary part of New Jersey, the kind of suburb that doesn't really stand out unless you've lived there. It wasn't gated or especially wealthy. Most of the houses were built sometime in the 70s or 80s, and by the time I was a teenager, everything had settled into that quiet, middle-aged rhythm where nothing seemed new anymore. My parents bought our house before I was born. It sat near the end of a cul-de-sac, backed up against a stretch of woods that technically belonged to the township, like tangled brush, trees that leaned over one another, and a narrow drainage creek that flooded every spring. Still, it gave our backyard a sense of privacy. There was only one narrow access point where the woods met a service road, and that road was blocked by a locked metal gate. As kids, we treated the backyard like a dead end. Nobody ever passed through it. My dad worked long hours, usually gone before sunrise and home just in time for dinner. My mom stayed up later than everyone else, watching TV or folding laundry at the kitchen table. I was the night owl. Even in high school, I stayed up late on the family computer, which sat in a corner of the living room. This was the early 2000s, before laptops were common, so the computer wasn't private. If you were online, you were out in the open. That night started without anything unusual. My parents had gone to bed early. I stayed up, half paying attention to something on the screen while listening to the house. The doorbell rang. That alone was enough to make me uneasy. Nobody we knew came over that late, and if there was an emergency, they'd usually call first. I remember pausing whatever I was doing and listening. The bell rang again, firmer this time, like whoever was outside wanted to make sure someone heard it. My dad came downstairs, already annoyed. I followed him to the front hallway, standing a few steps back. Through the frosted glass of the door, I could see the vague outline of someone standing on the porch. When my dad opened the door, a woman stood there. She looked tired, late 30s. She said her car had broken down and asked if she could use our phone. My dad glanced down the street. From the porch, you could see almost the entire cul-de-sac. There were no cars stopped on the road, no hazard lights, nothing idling at the corner. He asked where her car was. She hesitated, then said it wouldn't start and that she'd left it a little ways back and walked. That explanation didn't quite line up, but it wasn't impossible either. Cell phones weren't what they are now. Plenty of people still relied on landlines. After a brief pause, my dad stepped aside and let her in. She stayed right by the doorway, didn't look around much. She used the phone quickly, dialing a number she said belonged to a friend. She spoke quietly, turned slightly away from us. The call lasted less than a minute. When she hung up, she thanked my dad, apologized for the inconvenience, and left. I watched her walk back down the driveway. She didn't turn toward the road immediately. She stood near the mailbox for a moment, like she was waiting or listening, and then walked off toward the corner. I never saw a car. After the door closed, my dad locked it, which wasn't something he always did. He didn't say much, just told me to head to bed. The whole thing was odd. The next day passed normally. School, homework, dinner. It wasn't until the phone rang that evening that the memory came back. My dad answered it while my mom and I were in the kitchen. He listened for a few seconds, frowned, and hung up without saying anything. When the phone rang again 10 minutes later, I answered it. There was a man's voice on the other end. Deep, steady, and strangely flat. He didn't say hello. He started reciting numbers, not a phone number, just numbers. Groups of 3 or 4, spoken evenly, with short pauses in between. No emotion, no explanation. I waited for him to stop and say something else. He didn't. After like 15 seconds, the line went dead. When I told my parents, my dad assumed it was a prank. Wrong number, bored teenager, telemarketer glitch. We didn't think much more of it, even when the call came again later that night with the same voice and the same pattern of numbers. By the third call, my dad unplugged the phone. That should have been the end of it. Everyone went to bed around midnight. I stayed up again, sitting at the computer with the lights dimmed. The house felt empty in that way. It only does when you're the only one awake. It was after 1, and I noticed a light. I thought it was the hallway nightlight. We kept one plugged in near the stairs, but this was brighter, and it moved. I turned slightly in my chair and looked down the hallway that led to the bedrooms. The light shifted across the wall like someone was walking with a flashlight or a phone screen held low. I called out, assuming it was my dad getting a drink of water. No answer. The light reached the living room threshold. I stood up and reached for the lamp beside the couch, flipping it on without thinking. The man froze. He wasn't my father. He stood near the center of the living room, close enough that I could see his face clearly in the sudden light. He wore a dark jacket, zipped up, and held something in his hand, what looked like a phone, the screen still glowing. For half a second, we stared at each other. Then he ran. He moved fast, straight toward the front door, yanking it open and disappearing into the night. I screamed. The house erupted. My parents came running downstairs. My dad grabbed the nearest thing he could use as a weapon and rushed outside, but there was nothing there. The front door stood open. The cold air rushed in. The police arrived. They searched the area, checked the woods behind the house, the neighbors' driveways. They didn't find anyone. The door hadn't been damaged. The officer asked if we'd left it unlocked. In the days that followed, we replayed everything. The woman at the door, the phone calls, the man in the house. The police suggested the possibility that the woman and the man were connected, that she'd used the phone to confirm we were home, that the calls were a way of checking our routines. They said it could have been a burglary attempt gone wrong. That explanation made sense on paper, but it didn't explain why he'd come back after being seen, or how he'd gotten into the backyard days later. Because a few nights after the break-in, my dad and I saw him again. It was early evening. I was standing at the kitchen sink when I saw something beyond the glass doors. I looked out into the backyard and saw a man walking along the tree line, just inside the woods. I called my dad over. We watched together as the man stepped into the open yard. He held a phone to his ear. When he realized we were watching, he turned and ran back into the trees. The police never found him. No arrests were made. No clear explanation was ever given. We locked the doors every night after that. Whatever they were planning, it didn't happen. And I don't know if that makes me feel better or worse. I grew up on the edge of a mid-sized town in the early 2000s. We had paved roads and a mall, but once you went a few streets past the last row of shops, things thinned out fast. Empty lots, patches of trees, old structures no one seemed responsible for anymore. Our neighborhood backed up against a cemetery. It wasn't ancient or famous, just a local one that had been there long enough for the headstones near the back to sink into the ground at odd angles. The town had expanded around it instead of moving it, so by the time I was a teenager, you had houses on 3 sides and a 2-lane road running along the 4th. People drove past it every day without really noticing it. My family lived in a small single-story house about a 5-minute walk from that road. I was in my late teens then, old enough to have independence but still living at home. My parents both worked early shifts, so I was used to being on my own in the afternoons. I had a part-time job across town, and on days I didn't work, I'd usually walk to a friend's place or to the convenience store near the main road. Walking was normal where I lived. We didn't think much about it. Crime existed, obviously, but it wasn't something that shaped our daily decisions. People left bikes unlocked, kids walked home from school alone. The cemetery itself was mostly ignored. Teenagers dared each other to cut through it at night, but during the day it was just there, quiet and a little sad-looking, nothing more. That summer, I had gotten into a routine of walking in the early evening, after dinner hours, when the sun was low and the air cooled off. My parents didn't mind, and I'd been doing it for years without anything happening. The road by the cemetery was part of my usual route. It shaved 10 minutes off the walk, and there was a sidewalk on only one side which ran directly along the iron fence. On the other side was open ground that dipped slightly before leveling out again. Cars passed, but not constantly, mostly locals heading home. The day it happened felt ordinary in every way. I wasn't distracted enough to be careless, just relaxed. I saw the white car before I registered it as a problem. It was stopped ahead of me on the shoulder, angled slightly toward the road like someone had pulled over in a hurry. I assumed it was broken down or someone was checking directions. As I got closer, the driver's side door opened. A man stepped out. He didn't look frantic or aggressive at first. Middle-aged, average build, nothing about him that immediately set off alarms. He said something I couldn't hear clearly because of my music, so I took one out. He asked if I needed a ride. I said no, without stopping. I kept walking. He moved closer to the road, matching my pace. He said it again. This time he added that it was going to get dark soon. I told him I lived nearby. That was my mistake. I don't know why I said it. Reflex. Politeness mixed with a desire to end the conversation quickly. His expression changed when I said that. He glanced down the road in both directions. There were no cars coming. He reached for my arm. It wasn't a violent grab at first. He expected me to go along with it. When I pulled back, he tightened his grip immediately. There wasn't any yelling, no threats. He just started pulling me toward the car. That was when my brain finally caught up to what was happening. I dropped my phone and tried to twist away, but the way he was holding me made it awkward. He was stronger than I expected. The cemetery fence to my right, the open road to my left, no one else around. I started shouting. That seemed to surprise him. He cursed under his breath and yanked harder, trying to move faster like he wanted it over with. A car appeared at the far end of the road. The man hesitated. I twisted my arm sharply and stumbled backward. His grip slipped. I fell, scraped my knee, and scrambled up immediately. He reached for me again, but by then I was already moving. I ran straight toward the houses, not even looking back. I don't know if he followed me. I didn't check. I ran until my chest hurt and my legs felt unsteady, then ran more. When I got home, my parents were still at work. I locked the door and sat on the floor, shaking for a long time before I could even think about calling anyone. When I finally told my mother what happened, she came home immediately. My father followed. They called the police. There wasn't much to go on. White car, middle-aged man, no license plate, no witnesses. By the time they drove the area, there was nothing there. They suggested avoiding that road for a while. Over the next few weeks, things started to come out. A girl told her parents she'd seen a man standing just inside the cemetery fence while she walked home one evening. She thought he was visiting a grave until she realized he was watching the road, not the headstones. Another woman said she noticed someone crouched behind one of the larger monuments near the back, close to where the trees thickened. She didn't see his face, just the shape of someone who didn't belong there. At first, these stories were treated like coincidence. People talk, fear spreads, but the details lined up in ways that were hard to ignore. Always a man, always alone, always near the fence that ran alongside the road. The cemetery suddenly felt different. Parents stopped letting their kids walk past it. People drove the long way around. Someone suggested putting up lights, but it took months for anything to actually happen. The police increased patrols briefly, then tapered off. They never found anyone. What stayed with me wasn't just what happened on the road. It was the idea that someone had been watching that area for who knows how long. Waiting. Choosing moments. The cemetery is still there. The fence is newer now. There are lights along the road. People barely remember why those changes were made. But I do.